Hello, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Ryan Evans with the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And as always, I'd like to remind people that you can find an archive of all of our past webinars that we've been doing for over 2 years now, as well as a schedule of upcoming webinars in our series at our website. That's cap.unl.edu, cap.unl.edu, as you see there on the screen. With Election Day just weeks away, today's webinar will discuss 3 ballot issues that voters in Nebraska will decide on. Those issues are local payments to expand commercial airline service, photo ID requirements for Nebraska voters, and increasing the minimum wage from $9 to $15 per hour by 2026. And presenting today, we have Dave Aiken, professor and ag law and water law specialist here in the Department of Agricultural Economics at UNL. He'll discuss the positions of both supporters and opponents of each issue, as well as what the potential impact could be of each issue. As we go, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box or the Q&A box in your Zoom window, and Dave will answer those at the end of the session. So Dave, with that, thanks for being with us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ryan. Yep, we're going to talk about the 3 ballot issues that are going to be on. The first one, the airport one, came from the legislature, and then the other 2, the photo ID and the minimum wage, both came from initiative petition efforts. Okay, the first one is it actually ends up being kind of a technical amendment. Again, this is one proposed by the legislature. And the basic idea is that in many states, airports can offer minimum revenue guarantees to airlines to bring new flights to their airports. And this was proposed in Nebraska by a proposed bill in the legislature a few years ago, and the Attorney General said this would violate the Constitution because it would extend the credit of the state of Nebraska, as these contracts would be contingent in the sense that, you know, that if the revenue that they said they would guarantee, if at all, you know, if they got enough people on the flights so they didn't need the guarantee, there'd be no problem. But if they came up short and they would have to make a payment to keep that flight going, then that contract would be considered an extension of credit by an instrumentality of the state of Nebraska, in this case probably an airport authority. So the constitutional amendment basically says that it would be legal for any political subdivision that owns or operates an airport to enter into these types of contracts with the airlines. And it's very broad. There's no dollar amounts. There's no time limit in terms of how long the contracts can go. That would be up to the elected officials, you know, in the airport district or whoever the owner, the operator of the airport might be. Now, there has been, well, the people who are in favor of it say that, you know, this is having more and better commercial airline service is a great economic development resource. And I don't think there's much, I don't think anybody could really disagree with that. There has been no organized opposition, but just to fill in the line for the arguments against, just saying that, you know, these contracts would, you know, could increase local spending, you know, by these airport authorities or whomever. So that's But that one is really more of a technical amendment. I think the law would have been passed years ago if the Attorney General had not said that there was a constitutional problem with it. So now with this, if this passes in November, then I suspect that the legislation to authorize this will pass pretty early in 2023. Okay, the next one, photo voter ID. This is a controversial national issue. Voting rights are very controversial now at the national level, and we're seeing some of that in Nebraska, although we have had attempts to adopt photo voter ID requirements in the legislature for several years, and they have never been able to break the filibuster to get that across the finish line. So anyway, so it is on the ballot, and it's generated some controversy in Nebraska, but not nearly as much as it has at the national level. Okay, to try to make sense of this, I thought it would be helpful to see what other states are doing, and was able to find some information that helped me pull this together from the National Council of State Legislatures, excuse me. And there's somewhat more detail about this in the most recent Cornhusker Economics newsletter that just came out yesterday. And I believe Ryan is going to post that with the webpage for this webinar later on. But anyway, I'll take a quick shot. Basically, 15 states have some type of 35 states have some type of voter ID, and 15 states do not. So it's 35 states that do and 15 states that do not. And currently Nebraska is one of those 15 states that does not. Now, there are two types of voter ID categories. And then there are two options, general options that states take if you show up to vote and don't have the required identification with you. So voter ID, photo ID is, driver's license, state identification card, military ID, as long as they're current and valid, then in the states that have photo ID requirements, those are the types of things that would be required. The other type of ID would be something like some document that doesn't come from you as the individual voter, but somebody sent it to you, and it's got your name and address on it, and that would be like a current bank statement, current utility bill, paycheck, government check, these sorts of things. So you've got the photo ID in one category, and then the non-photo ID in the other category. And it turns out there's a pretty even split. There's 18 photo ID states and 17 non-photo ID states. So 35 require some identification, 18 photo ID, and then the other 17 non-photo ID. Now, what happens if you show up to vote and you don't have the required identification? Well, there's two broad categories in terms of how states respond to this. And I call them the two-trip rule and the one-trip rule. The two-trip rule is what I call, what the National Council of State Legislatures calls the strict voter identification requirements. And under the strict rule, if you don't have your ID when you come to vote, you can either go home and get the ID and come back and vote on election day in some states. Then in the other states, you go home and you get your ID, and then after the election, you go to your local election office. So in most of Nebraska, that would be to the county clerk's office because they're the county election official. In counties where they have election commissioners like Lancaster, for example, you would go to the election commission, and then they would look at your photo ID. And I'm guessing, I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing that in order to see whether your photo ID is valid, they're going to need to be hooked into some sort of database that has everybody's pictures. I'm not positive about how this would be implemented, but it seems to me that might be a requirement if voters pass this bill. This proposed constitutional amendment. Anyway, that's not spelled out in the constitutional amendment itself, so that would be up to the legislature. So we've got of the 35 states, 12 states follow the 2-trip rule, and 23 states follow the 1-trip rule. And so that's 1/3 is the strict and 2/3 in round numbers is the not strict. And just thinking about it myself, I would guess that a lot of voters, if they go and they say, sorry, you don't have the right ID, you can't vote today, for most of them, that would be the end of it. They'll say, fine, I'll vote in the next election 2 years from now. But, that's only time will tell, but I suspect that's what would happen. Okay. Now, how do we do it now in Nebraska? Well, in Nebraska on voting day, when you come in, the poll worker at your voting precinct will ask you for your name and address. And if your name and address are on the list of registered voters for that precinct, then you sign in. And then after you sign in, they'll give you your ballot and you can vote. And if any problems arise with your vote, or if somebody else tries to vote with your name or something like that, they can compare the signature when you signed in to vote that day with the signature on the voter registration card or form that you filed when you first registered to vote in Nebraska. Now, this is interesting. I was just, grubbing around in the election statutes, and it turns out that to register to vote in Nebraska, you need a photo ID. But after you register, you don't need a photo ID to vote. After that, you just need it up front to register, which makes sense. If you register to vote by mail instead of registering to vote in person, then the first time you vote, you'll also need a photo ID to make sure that you're who you registered to vote as and that. But if you register in person, as most people do, you're my age, I don't think you could register to vote by mail back then, but you can now. But you needed the photo ID up front in order to get registered. Okay. Some think that the initiative 432, the way that it is written, requires the legislature to go with the 2-trip rule, and somebody does not have their photo ID, the required photo ID when they come to vote. And you can certainly read the initiative that way, and I think it's a fair reading of the initiative. However, the courts tend to give the legislature some latitude in implementing these new constitutional provisions, and so it's very possible, especially if you're trying to overcome a filibuster, it's very possible that there could be they could go with a 1-trip rule or something like that. But we'll have to see how that plays out. Now, one thing where the photo ID requirements, I think, would make a big deal is for mail voting. Basically, I think if we adopt Initiative 432, then you'll probably have to include a copy of the required photo ID for along with your vote by mail paperwork. And voting by mail has become fairly popular in Nebraska, but I think that having this extra step to take might make it a bit less popular down the road. And I'm not going to speculate about what people's intentions might be in terms of why they're proposing, why they got this on the ballot or anything like that. But I do think that that we could see a drop off in mail ballots if the Initiative 432 is adopted. Okay, the Secretary of State is required to prepare summaries of the ballot initiatives and ones that have been put on the ballot, through the petition process. And so 432 and 433 both have pros and cons identified by the Secretary of State's office, and that's basically where I've taken these. People in support of 432 believe that it would improve voter security, and although we haven't had significant voter fraud in Nebraska, certainly in recent years, probably have to go back a long ways to when the political bosses ran the political machine in Omaha back in maybe in the 1920s or 1930s, something like that. But be that as it may, the further argument is that having this photo ID requirement to vote would give voters who are worried about voter fraud, it would give them more confidence in our elections here in Nebraska. And then they make the point that for a lot of very common consumer transactions, some type of photo ID is required. And I know when I go to get hay fever over-the-counter stuff at the drugstore, I have to show my driver's license in order to let them know I'm not a meth cooker or something like that, which is great. I mean, I'm all in favor of that. But that's an example of, there are lots of other medicines that you need photo ID for, and it's not just when you go to the drugstore either. So, I think that's a valid point. Okay, the people against it have argued that it will discourage some from voting. And to me, that would probably be the poor and the elderly, particularly the elderly who don't have, family to get everything organized for them and, get them, take them to vote in person and all of that kind of stuff. So that's, I think that some will be discouraged from voting. And I think the same point is true for the mail ballot as well. In terms of another argument that the folks opposed to LB 432 made is 432 make is that voter fraud is not common in Nebraska, And so there's not a real election security problem out there. And I know I think earlier this week, the Lincoln paper basically made that argument as being why they would recommend a vote against Initiative 432. But that's again, that's a very controversial issue, is a very controversial issue at the national level. But it'll be very interesting to see how it plays out nationally. It's generally been the Republican Party that has promoted these types of election changes, and so I suspect that, well, we'll just see how it plays out in Nebraska. Okay, this is our last one. Boy, I don't think I skipped any slides, but if I do, let me know in the Q&A and we'll go back and get it. But I think we didn't skip any. Okay, this is increasing the minimum wage. And our current minimum wage in Nebraska is $9 per hour. And Initiative 433 would increase this by $1.50 for the next 4 years, so that by 2026, the minimum wage, the Nebraska minimum wage would be $15 an hour. Now, there are quite a few exceptions, employees who are not covered by the Nebraska minimum wage. And that's if you have no more than 3 employees, not including seasonal employees, you don't have to pay the minimum wage. Ag workers are not covered by the minimum wage. Government workers, babysitters, apprentices, trainees, immediate family members. That's not all of them, but that's a lot of them. And those exemptions or exceptions to the minimum wage requirement would not be changed by Initiative 433. And I'm sure that a lot of you would think that, well, what about waiters and waitresses, who get tips, and that's part of their wage? Aren't they covered by the minimum wage? And it's a little bit different because it's a little bit complicated, but the sum of their tips and whatever the wage is that they're paid by their employer has to equal on a per hour basis the minimum wage. And if it's less than the $9 an hour today, then the employer has to make up the difference so that they're getting the $9 per hour for however many hours they work. And they're not paying the entire $9. They're paying maybe $9 minus whatever they get from with tips or something like that. Anyway, that's kind of how that works. But in terms of an annual income for a minimum wage worker, this would go from $18,720, which is what it is now, to $31,200 in 2026. So that's a significant boost. I think that's 2/3 increase. Yes, 2/3. So that's a significant increase. Okay. There we go. Sorry. Just for reference, the poverty guidelines for a single person is $13,590, and it goes up to $32,470 for a family of 5. I've got more detailed breakouts on that in the Cornhusker Economics, so if you're interested in that, that information is in there. Initiative 433 is not a constitutional amendment. but it would amend Nebraska minimum wage statutes. And the Constitution says that under those circumstances, if the legislature wants to change a statutory provision that's been adopted by the voters, then they have to have a 2/3 vote in order to do it. My experience has been that legislators do not ever want to change a statutory provision that has been adopted by the voters. So that, but that's, that's what the legal, that's what it would take legally if the legislature decided for whatever reason to do so. Okay, the persons and the groups in favor of Initiative 433 say that it would move, many minimum wage workers out of poverty. And I guess I should just mention very quickly, I think the minimum wage workers would include, fast food workers, waiters and waitresses. And I try to explain how that worked. But also a lot of the aides in public schools are minimum wage workers. Home health care aides are also typically minimum wage workers. So there are a lot of, well, perhaps more people than you might think who are minimum wage workers. It's not just the high school kids working at the fast food place. It's more than that. And last time I was at the high school, the last time I was at a fast food place, at least a couple of people behind the counter were, I would say, in their 40s or 50s. So they were, definitely, majority were high school age kids, but not everybody was. And not everybody behind the counter, not all the older folks, I think, are supervisors. So anyway, okay, the folks against Initiative 433 basically say it would make some, if not a lot, of the minimum wage workers too expensive for their employers to be able to afford. So that some people that have a minimum wage job now might, as these $1.50 increases go into effect, might end up losing that job somewhere in the next year or 2 or 3. So, and clearly it would raise the labor cost for, employers who hire minimum wage workers. There's no 2 ways about that. Okay, that's all I had. We had a lot of issues that people circulated petitions for. There were a handful on guns. I can't remember what some of the other ones were about, but we had a lot of them. One making the Board of Education gubernatorial appointees rather than elected by regions or districts. Anyway, there are a lot of very interesting ones that did not get the signatures that they needed. Oh, medical marijuana, there were a couple of them dealing with that as well. That was also a big one. But that's all we have this year. So it'll be interesting to see how it all shakes out on election day. And with that, I think I will share my screen and turn it back to Ryan. We have lots of times for questions.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Great work. And as Dave mentioned, we do have time for questions here. So if you have not yet and you have a question or for Dave here, go ahead and put that into the Q&A box or the chat box in your Zoom screen. And Dave, we had several questions before you started talking about it, before you got to the part about voter ID for mail-in voters, about how that would work. And you addressed that, speculating that perhaps you'd be required to include a copy of your identification in the mail-in ballot. Do you know in your research, did you come across how other states have handled that?
Yeah, pretty much. They have pretty much either when you apply for your mail ballot or when you submit your mail ballot, you have to include in that application or voting paperwork, you have to include a copy, like a Xerox copy or a printout of your driver's license or whatever the required voting ID would be. And so if I'm in the election commissioner's office and I get Dave Aiken's application for mail ballot and they've got a picture of Dave Aiken's driver's license in that application, they're not going to have me there to compare the picture with. So they're going to have to be able to look me up. If that photo ID is going to mean anything, they're going to have some way to look up my picture, either on on some sort of state government database, whether it's the Department of Motor Vehicles for people with driver's licenses, or I don't know how they do it for the state ID cards, whether that's a separate, not through the motor vehicles, but through someplace else. I mean, I just don't know how that works. But they're going to have. It seems to me that they're going to have some way to look up, to get a picture of me that's that they know is a correct picture of me through the state, to compare the Xerox picture of my driver's license that they get to see whether I'm for real or whether I'm trying to pull one over on them. So I think there are some complications ahead if this thing is adopted. It's nothing that can't be resolved. And fortunately, we have, before we have the 2024 would be the next general election. Cities may have elections between now and 2024, but the next general election would be 2024. And so the election officials and whomever would have that 2-year period to get geared up to be able to handle the photo ID requirement. It's not something that if it passes, that all you have to do is show up and show them your driver's license. It will be more complicated than that, and there no doubt will be expense involved in that, in terms of making sure that all the at every precinct, they'll be able to hook into some secure network to compare, when they see my driver's license. Well, I guess they can compare that to me. They don't need to go online to do that unless they don't think I look like the driver's license photo. Then they would want to go online to kind of break the tie. But, there are things like that that will have to be worked through. But we'll just see how that plays out.
Yeah, great. And really important considerations, as one comment pointed out in the chat, that their local voting area was disbanded, so they have no choice but to vote by mail, which is definitely a factor in rural parts of the state, I think. So we have another question. You mentioned state ID cards. There's been some question as to whether a state ID card is acceptable to everywhere, such as boarding an airplane or entry into federal facilities. Do you know or do you sense that there's any restrictions on state ID cards being valid for a voter ID potentially, or if the legislature could conceivably come around and declare those invalid, or what the status is of anything beyond a driver's license?
Well, most of the states that I looked at, and I just looked at summaries. I wasn't, looking at direct state statutes or anything like that. But most of them have, like 4 or 5 or 6 types of photo IDs, so that you're not limited to the driver's license. And, military ID, as long as it's current, student ID. So if you're at community college or university or something like that, and you're currently a student, and that, those would all be examples of things that were common. Tribal IDs, photo IDs. I don't know if our tribes in Nebraska do that, but apparently in other parts of the U.S. they do, and they were on the list that some states said, yeah, that would count as a valid photo ID, to vote. So, but the 432 would leave it up to the legislature to decide what kind of ID, would be photo ID, would meet the constitutional requirement. And the ones that I had on the slide are basically the ones that, if you registered to vote by mail, when you originally registered to vote, the first time you vote, you have to show photo ID for them to verify who you are before you can vote for the very first time in Nebraska. And, the state identification card is one of them that is in that voting statute already in Nebraska. So I'd be stunned if they excluded the state ID card. I wouldn't believe it, because we've got that program for people who don't drive. That's specifically what it's for. It would make no sense for them not to include it. And I'm sure it'll be very high on the list after driver's license.
Great, thank you. Reminder, we do have some time left, so if you do have a question for Dave about what he's been discussing here today, please pop that into the chat box or the Q&A box in your Zoom window. Another one here, Dave, talking about 433, if it would potentially affect general product prices throughout the state, would increased labor costs be passed off to consumers in that situation, do you think, if minimum wage was raised?
Sure. I wouldn't be surprised. I'll just pick fast food because that's where a lot of the minimum wage workers are. So I would expect that if what they have to pay their employees went up, that in time, those increased labor costs, at least some of those costs, if not all of them, would be passed on to employees in terms of higher prices. I don't know if anybody has done any estimates of what it might mean, but certainly that would be that would be a possibility. Now, in some places, if you're talking about the teaching aides in the public schools, that might increase, the school operating costs, or they might have to do with fewer of the aides. Who knows how it'll shake out, but that would definitely be a possibility.
Perfect. Thank you, Dave. Well, so far I don't see any more questions. So as we wrap up, I'll give you one more chance here to type in a question if you have it. We do have some time, but if not, we will wrap up. And I'll just start that by saying that next week, we hope you can join us. We have a really interesting webinar, October 27th at at noon again, on crop insurance fraud, and that will feature a conversation actually with a Nebraska producer who was recently convicted of fraud, and it will be all about the crop insurance process and how others can hopefully avoid being put in that situation of committing fraud on your crop insurance claims. So join us for that next Thursday, and a recording of today's webinar should be available in our webinar archive. We'll go ahead and post the slides along with Dave's recent Cornhusker economics article on these 3 ballot initiatives there. If you check out our website, cap.unl.edu, that's cap.unl.edu, that should be up later this afternoon or certainly by tomorrow afternoon. And looks like we got one more chat here, Dave. Okay, can you explain why political subdivisions do not have the authority currently for expanding commercial airline service?
Okay. There's a provision in the Nebraska Constitution that says that basically the state of Nebraska cannot extend credit, to anyone. And then there's a couple of exceptions. I think, public housing may be one exception, something like that. But for a long time, there were basically no exceptions, and the state of Nebraska could not go into debt and could not extend credit to for any purpose. And so these guaranteed revenue contracts that in other states, airport authorities or communities sign with airlines to get them to agree to come and serve their community. And if they come up short on passengers and stuff, then under the agreement, the airport authority or the community will make up the difference in the revenue that they didn't get by not having enough passengers. That's the kind of situation that they were talking about in terms of this proposed Amendment 1. And so the idea is that if Amendment 1 is adopted, then this will be a constitutional authorization for airport authorities or communities to enter into these agreements, even though those agreements could be extended. It could be interpreted as being extending the credit of the state of Nebraska to, in this case, an airline, by saying that, we'll make up your losses on this route, if you agree to initiate this new flight into wherever. And so that's the legal issue that is the reason for the proposed Amendment 1. If we didn't have that constitutional provision, then I think legislation to authorize this probably would have been passed 3 or 4 years ago. But they got the Attorney General opinion saying that no, this constitutional provision is a hang-up. And so the legislature said, okay, we want to pass this, but we can't do it now. So let's fix the Constitution so that after the Constitution is fixed, we can come back and do it then. And I suspect that basically, since there's no organized opposition, I think this probably will pass. And I think most people think it's a good idea if they understand what it's about. And so if it does pass, then I think that would probably move through the legislature pretty quickly next year.
All right, great. Well, thank you, Dave, and thank you again to everybody who has attended today. Again, a recording of today's webinar should be up on our website at cap.unl.edu later this afternoon or tomorrow morning. And don't forget, Election Day is Tuesday, November 8th, coming right up here. And look for this recording and register for other recordings again on our website, cap.unl.edu. So Dave, thanks very much for the great info and looking into these issues so much. And like you said, we'll post that new article you wrote for Cornhusker Economics along with the recording today.
Great. Thanks a million, Ryan.
All right. Thank you. And thanks again to everybody for attending. And I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.